Now, Clare Lopez is the Vice President for Research and Analysis at the Center for Security Policy, a Senior Fellow at the London Center for Policy Research, and a member of the Board of Advisors for the Canadian McKinsey Institute. Since 2018, she served as a member of the Citizens Commission on Benghazi, formerly Vice President of the Intelligence Summit. She was a career operations officer with the Central Intelligence Agency, a professor at the Center for Counterintelligence and Security Studies, Executive Director of the Iran Policy Committee from 2005 to 2006, and has served as a consultant, intelligence analyst, and researcher for a variety of defense firms. She was also named a 2011 Lincoln Fellow at the Claremont Institute. She holds a BA in Communications in French from Notre Dame College of Ohio, and an MA in International Relations from the Maxwell School of Syracuse University. Clare, welcome to the program Going Global with David Delgado.
Hi, David. Thank you. Very glad to be with you.
Well, it's very good to have you back again. You are certainly well qualified to speak on the subject matter this evening. So thank you again for agreeing to join us. Clare, to start off the conversation, tell us a little bit about yourself, and then I want to segue into the Center for Security Policy. But let's start off by you telling us in your own words a little bit about you.
Well, you pretty much read through my bio there. I have been with the Center for Security Policy here in one capacity or another since about 2009, when the Center published my first paper with them, the Iran Lobby, about the coterie of agents of influence of Tehran that were coming into Washington, D.C. on the coattails of then newly elected President Barack Obama. I became a fellow with the Center the year after, 2010 till 2014, and full-time here at the Center since 2014, focused on issues of national security. And for me, in particular, especially the Middle East, Islam, Jihad, Sharia, Iran, and related issues.
Yes, and so tell us about the Center for Security Policy, what it does, what its mission is.
So we are a small Washington, D.C. think tank. We're a 501c3, non-profit, non-sectarian organization, non-governmental organization. Our mission in that category is primarily education, and so we focus on briefings, including to members of Congress who might request them. We do a lot of speaking around the country to various different groups that invite us. Engage in training courses. I, in particular, do, along with John Guandolo, at Understanding the Threat, understandingthethreat.com, where we train not only civilians, but also local law enforcement as the front line of defense against Islam, Jihad, and Sharia. And then we do a lot of media, like this radio show, thank you very much, and also TV.
Well, and that's obviously the intent of this program is to provide sources like yourself to air views and discuss them, put them on the table, and discuss the results of your research and your particular views. So once again, thank you for coming on the program, and we welcome your continued participation. Let's start out by asking the question, is this a conflict with Sharia? You mentioned Sharia law. Is this a conflict with Islam, or is this a conflict with Iran?
Yes, to all of the above. I would direct perhaps listeners' attention to the Iranian Constitution, which can be found online in English. The first version was put out by the Ayatollah Khomeini shortly after the revolution in Iran in 1979. A slightly amended version with mostly administrative changes dates from 1989. And that constitution says very clearly, very plainly, that the Iranian regime exists in order to pursue jihad worldwide in order to establish a global Islamic state under rule of Islamic law. That's what the Constitution says. And then they quote, in fact, from the Quran in the Iranian Constitution, and they quote from verse 860, which says, make ready your forces to the utmost of your ability, including steeds of war, to strike terror into the hearts of the enemy. That is part of the Iranian constitution. So I think we can be left in no doubt whatsoever about the purpose of that regime, its faithful and devout commitment to Islam and to Islamic law.
Well, let me just read the preamble in English of the Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran, as amended 1989, and what I'm reading. I'm going to ask you to further comment on this. In the organization and equipping of the country's defense forces, there must be regard for faith and religion as their bases and rules, and so the Islamic Republic's army and the Corps of Revolutionary Guards must be organized in accordance with the same. They have responsibility not only for the safeguarding of the frontiers, but also for a religious mission, which is jihad, along the way of God and the struggle to extend the supremacy of God's law in the world. That's quote unquote.
Exactly. That does come from the 1989 version, well, the 1979 one as well, of the Iranian Constitution, and it's a paragraph that refers very specifically to the IRGC, that is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and the title, the header of that paragraph is an ideological army. That's the title of the paragraph that describes the mission of the IRGC as not just for the defense of the borders. Iran has, in fact, a full-fledged military, Army, Navy, and Air Force that is tasked with the defense of Iranian borders, and the IRGC's specific mission is different than that. As you can see, it is jihad fi sabilillah in order to spread the Sharia across the entire world.
I want to quote one more verse from the Quran, and it's chapter 8, verse 60, and it reads in English, translated into English, "Against them make ready your strength to the utmost of your power, including steeds of war, to strike terror into the hearts of the enemies of God and your enemies and others besides." Now, I mean, that's clearly stating we're going to war. We prepare for war.
Yes, that's the verse that I just cited a moment ago. Exactly.
Yeah. That is the verse that you paraphrased just a few minutes ago. With that in mind, is it any surprise that conflict continues to exist with between Iran and the United States, and really Iran and the West?
No, it should not be surprising at all. And I think we really need to take note of the motivation, the inspiration for the Iranian regime's behavior. And when we hear hopes, that the regime's behavior can somehow be changed, or that regime can somehow be persuaded to act like a normal nation, it really exhibits unfamiliarity with what really and truly guides the leadership of that regime. Now, you'll notice I'm talking about the regime, and that is the mullahs, of course, the supreme leader, the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and the guns that keep him in power, the IRGC, its division of the Quds Force, the Basij, which are the street militia that keep order and assault the Iranian people on the streets of Iran, the MOIS, Ministry of Intelligence and Security, that's their intelligence service. But I'm not talking about the Iranian people. The Iranian people have actually been in the streets demonstrating, protesting, going on strike since late 2017, end of December 2017. So we're well into, over a year and a half that the Iranian people have made very clear in their placards and in their slogans and their chants that they want an end to this regime. They are chanting things like Marg Bar Dictator, that's death to the dictator, that means the supreme leader. There are spray-painted graffiti all over the city, cities, plural, on walls, death to Khamenei. You didn't hear this back in 2009 when the people took to the streets in protest against the fraudulent I'll call it selection of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad to the presidency in that year. But this time you do. They're protesting not just about economics, which are terrible. The sanctions really do hit the people very hard. That is true. They're not just talking about the neglect of the regime for environmental concerns, the terrible floods this past spring that took so many lives. Not just all of that, but also the very nature of the regime itself. You see these brave women all over Iran taking off the hijab, the headscarf, that they are mandated, obligated to wear by law, by Iranian law. And those who are caught sometimes dragged off to jail, tortured, even killed for not wearing a hijab. So this is what's going on inside of Iran, and that's the distinction I want to make between the people and the regime that oppresses them.
Okay, but what's different between now and 2009, where it's no secret it was still a repressive regime. The Ayatollahs were still being accused of enriching themselves and taking hordes of millions of dollars for themselves as the generals. Why now? Why these protests now, as opposed to 2009 and before, where these protests didn't happen?
Well, I think the level of frustration has gotten just that much higher. During the Obama years, the regime in Iran told the people that the nuclear deal, for example, the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and all the wonderful largesse from the Obama administration, those shrink-wrapped pallets full of European currency that were flown on unmarked planes into Iran by the billions, that would all be to the benefit of the Iranian people. And then they saw instead that the regime took all those billions, the regime took whatever it had and stole more in order to prop up a genocidal regime in Damascus of Bashar al-Assad, to send the money to Iran's terror proxies. Its preferred way, by the way, of operating through proxies, Islamic Jihad terror militias, like Hezbollah, like Hamas, like the Shiite terror militias in Iraq, sometimes called the Hashd al-Shabi. They saw where the money was going. They knew that it wasn't helping them. They know that, I don't know what the percentage is even, but I've seen numbers like 40% and more of Iranian people actually living below the poverty line, not the American poverty line where you get, flat screen TVs and bags of potato chips. No, they're talking about the Iranian poverty line, 40% or more living under it right now. So their situation has gotten much worse, and they blame the regime not just for its inherent corruption. Power corrupts, and absolute power has totally corrupted that regime, but also because they see their own situation getting worse and worse despite all kinds of promises.
Let me ask you this. Are you familiar with the, and I'm sure you are, the National Council for Resistance of Iran, and the president of the organization is Dr. Miriam Rajavi. She's articulated a 10-point plan for the future of Iran. I don't know if you've had a chance to see that plan or not. Regardless, she lives in the United States. What are your thoughts regarding, if you're familiar with the plan, the 10-point plan for the future of Iran articulated by her, or if not, she's obviously calling for change in Iran. She's calling for democracy. She's calling for elections. She's calling for women's rights, and women's rights not to be trounced by a man's rights. What do you feel about this, the future of Iran with respect to that?
Well, you're talking about the National Council of Resistance of Iran, of course, which came into being in the very early years after the revolution, which the primary group within the NCRI's political umbrella is the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, or MEK.
Correct.
They helped to overthrow the Shah because they saw him as an autocratic monarch, which he was, and they sought greater representation and democracy. Well, very shortly after the revolution, by 1980, when there were supposed to be free and fair open elections, they began to see that that was not going to happen at all, and Khomeini, this is the Ayatollah Khomeini's goons, the IRGC, created very soon after the revolution, began to gun people down in the streets by the thousands, wiping out most of the coalition, which included various and different groups that had helped to oust the Shah, gunning them all down in the street. And they very soon realized that this is not what they were expecting at all. And so they went into exile, first in Iraq, later on in Paris, or I should say outside of Paris in a suburb. And most recently now, the headquarters has been relocated for the NCRI to Albania, outside of Tirana, the capital there. And yes, the 10-point plan of Mariam Rajavi, the elected leader of the NCRI, does call for a representative, democratic-style government in Iran. It calls for individual liberty. It calls for equality before the law, before man-made law, not Sharia. That means equality of men and women. It means equality between Muslims and non-Muslims. It calls for an end to all support for the regional terror organizations that we were talking about before. It calls for an end to all WMD. Your listeners probably know that Iran has a very advanced nuclear weapons program, biological weapons program, and chemical weapons program, in addition to the ballistic missile program that would carry such warheads. An end to all of that, an end to the death penalty. This is all within the 10-point plan of the NCRI, which anyone can have a look at by going to the website of the NCRI, National Council of Resistance of Iran.
And I have to add, for the benefit of the listeners, that the MEK, and hence the NCRI, was initially designated a terrorist organization by the West and by the United States. That designation was removed, I believe, in 2010, 2012, no longer recognized as a terrorist organization. As a matter of fact, if it weren't for the MEK in 2003, the West would not have known about Iran's nuclear weapons program that was discovered. And there were several sites that were reported by the MEK initially, I guess, denied by the Iranian regime, and then ultimately they couldn't deny the existence of Natanz, for instance, and Fordow, for instance. These were clearly reported by the MEK that initially was designated a terrorist organization. Ultimately, that designation was removed. Now, back to the question in terms of the regime itself. How has the regime managed to stay in power for these past 4 decades? Which literally, that's what it's been since 1979.
The regime stays in power through terror, terror and oppression. And I will mention about the MEK and how it and the NCRI wound up on the U.S. Foreign Terrorist Organization list.
Appeasement, I believe, but go ahead.
At the behest of the president of Iran, President Khatami, who came to power in Iran in 1997 during the U.S. administration of Bill Clinton, who turned to the new Iranian president and said, Mr. President, your eyes twinkle so behind your glasses. Can you please tell us what can we do to help you? And quick as that, Khatami said, put the MEK on your list. And for no other reason than that, no basis whatsoever in any kind of terrorism, certainly nothing against the United States ever. Bill Clinton put the MEK and later the NCRI on the list. They litigated that designation through the courts. And eventually, 15 years later, in 2012, United States courts had to agree there is absolutely no foundation whatsoever for them to be on the list, and the State Department was forced to remove them in that year, 2012. You're absolutely right also about the role that the NCRI has played in the revelations about Iran's clandestine nuclear weapons program. We'll remember that it was the Ayatollah Khomeini himself in the late 80s, before he died, who set that nuclear weapons program in motion around 88 or so. The IRGC was put in charge of it. They went straight to A.Q. Khan in Pakistan, the so-called father of the Pakistani bomb, got the blueprints, got some parts for new centrifuges, and off they went. That program, however, remained clandestine, unknown to the public, until the NCRI blew the lid off of it in August of 2002 with simultaneous press conferences in both Paris and Washington, D.C. Many of the revelations that have come since then about Iran's clandestine sites, to include Natanz, to include the Kaylee electric plant, to include Labizan, and many more, came from the NCRI. And most recently, when we saw a year ago Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu making an announcement about the Mossad's success in removing thousands of files and CD disks and folders, information about Iran's clandestine nuclear weapons program from the middle of Tehran, you can be sure, we can all be sure, that they didn't do that all by themselves. And so the role of the MEK, the benefit, the value of that organization continues, and by the way, is also very likely part of an important part of the organization of all the protests and demonstrations going on inside of Iran.
Yes, and this despite the fact that the MEK at the time was still designated a terrorist organization by the West, and yet they continued to reveal this kind of information to the United States. And as you said, it was really just at the behest of Bill Clinton. It was for no other reason. They had never conducted a terrorist act, a known terrorist act, outside of Iran or directed at other than the administration. And yet it was...
the regime. You mean against the regime?
Yes, I'm sorry. Against the regime, not the administration. You are correct. Against the regime. And they still continue to provide information. We're going to be taking a short break right now. We're speaking with Ms. Clare Lopez, Vice President for Research and Analysis at the Center for Security Policy, a Senior Fellow at the London Center for Policy Research, and former CIA Operations Officer. And the topic is conflict with Iran inevitable? And if so, what would it look like? We're going to be coming right back and touching on just that exact topic when we return. Stay with us. Welcome back to Going Global with David Delgado. We're talking to Clare Lopez, Vice President for Research and Analysis at the Center for Security Policy. She's also a Senior Fellow at the London Center for Policy Research and a former CIA Operations Officer. The topic for this evening is conflict with Iran inevitable? And if so, what would it look like? Clare, Rouhani, and I mentioned this in my opening statement, and I think you kind of alluded to it in your description, our discussion regarding Iran's nuclear capability, their advanced nuclear program. Rouhani said, if we have war with the United States, it'll be the mother of all wars. He also said it'll be the mother of all peace, but he said the mother of all wars. What, in your opinion, does that mean? What is the mother of all wars?
Well, the Iranian regime in Tehran knows perfectly well that it cannot stand up to the United States of America or our military capabilities. And so what it's doing instead is projecting, bluster and bravado. It knows that it is no match for the U.S. Navy, never mind the rest of the U.S. forces. And so what else can they do except, bluster and threaten? The United States is working to put together a coalition. So far, it looks like the Brits are joining us. Perhaps others might. The Danes, perhaps. Where the Maersk shipping line is headquartered. But that escort service would be to escort with military ships, commercial shipping going through the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. Those are international waters. There's nothing that Iran can do to stop that. They know that. They know that they do not want a full-blown conflict with the United States, which is why they keep pushing the envelope just to the edge. And as I've said before, preferring always to work through proxies rather than full-on frontally. So I really do think that it's a false kind of a choice that some try to lay out, which is either we give in and give up and just do nothing, throw in the towel, or it's going to be full-on nuclear war. I mean, that's kind of silly, right? There are many steps in between which President Trump, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and of course National Security Advisor John Bolton are well aware of and are employing in the interim. Primary of which are sanctions, very tough, biting sanctions that restrict the ability of the Iranian regime and specific individuals in the Iranian regime, notably the Supreme Leader himself, Khamenei, and most recently the Foreign Minister, Javad Zarif, restrict them and their top military commanders at the IRGC from being able to move money easily through the banking system of the world. In other words, they've shut off their ability to access gazillions of dollars kept in offshore accounts, as in Switzerland, for example, and that really has had an effect. We have heard, for example, that salaries to places or to groups like Hezbollah have been cut. However, at the same time, we hear that they're going to boost up their financial support to the Muslim Brotherhood representative Islamic terror jihad group Hamas in Gaza, and they have promised to increase payments there. So what I'm saying, though, is that all of this lies in some sort of a murky middle area that I really don't see us moving out of. Obviously, the Trump administration is not going to just give up and throw in the towel, and obviously the Iranian regime knows full well that it cannot engage in all-out full warfare with the United States, because they'd be obliterated, in the first 30 minutes. So,
well, at this point, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think they do know that they cannot go head-to-head with the United States, but that's assuming that they engage in conventional warfare. What about unconventional warfare? In your opinion, do they have nuclear weapons now?
Well, the Iranians certainly, according to the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, reports going back at least to November of 2011 was a very notable one. According to the IAEA, the Iranians have been building warheads, at least warheads since at least that time. That's 7-8 years ago. But whether they've actually succeeded in marrying up their warheads to the missiles, which we already also know that they have, remains unknown, at least publicly or to me. We do know that the Iranian regime works very closely with the North Korean regime of Kim Jong-un, and that the Pyongyang regime absolutely has successfully miniaturized warheads, MIRVed warheads. That means multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles. It's multiple missiles or multiple nuclear warheads on one warhead. And married up their warheads to their missiles. We know that they know that in North Korea. We also know that North Korea possesses EMP capability, electromagnetic pulse capability, which is a nuclear bomb exploded in the high atmosphere, which would set off a charge, a stream of electromagnetic pulse charges to the Earth, which, because the U.S. civilian electric grid remains to this date completely unprotected, would fry our electric grid. All of that is known to be possessed by the North Koreans. We also know that the North Koreans have worked very closely with the Iranians, also the Damascus regime of Bashar al-Assad, for many, many years on chemical, biological, nuclear, and ballistic missile programs. So I think it's reasonable to at least be concerned that Iran probably has much of the same technology, at least the blueprints for it, that North Korea has. Whether they themselves have succeeded in putting it all together remains a question I cannot answer. But we know that they've been building warheads. At the minimum, we know that they have missiles, nuclear-capable missiles. The question remains, have they married them up?
Well, and that's my concern, too, and has been all along, that they have the capability, or do they have the capability, to launch an EMP strike against the United States. As you indicated, we know the North Koreans do, and we know that they've been working very closely, not only with the North Koreans, but with the Russians and even the Chinese on exchanging technology, exchanging expertise. So if the North Koreans have it, it's might be a safe assumption to assume that the Russians have also provided it to, and the North Koreans have provided it to Iran to one degree or another. Hence the fear that, an EMP strike is a very real possibility against the United States, given the devastation that it would cause without destruction. It would be devastation without destruction. So very much a concern. I would agree that the warfare, if there were to be war between the two countries, it would not be conventional. It would not be one-on-one. They would not stand there and go toe-to-toe because they can't. Hence, other kinds of warfare, including cyber warfare, including inciting groups like Hezbollah and other groups like them. But here's a question that obviously, lends itself to the question of development does. The Trump administration designated the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps as a foreign terrorist organization earlier this year. Now, that's the first time that the U.S. has done so, has used such a designation on part of another country's government. Doesn't that give the United States, the U.S., the authority to target the commanders such as Major General Qasem Soleimani? And others. In other words, take them out before they engage in these kinds of strikes.
Yes, certainly it does. It doesn't mean that the Trump administration will give the go-ahead to do that, but I think you're very right to point out how the Iranian regime uses proxies. The Quds Force, of course, commanded by Major General Qasem Soleimani, has a presence across the world and is the direct chain of command commander for Hezbollah, operating out of Lebanon, but with a very extensive cell network presence inside the United States of America. Hezbollah engages certainly in criminality, including narco-trafficking, but as recent arrests from last year and other times indicate, those cell members are engaged in more than simply criminality or drug trafficking. They are involved, and they have been so charged in federal court with pre-attack casing and surveillance against American targets, Israeli targets in the United States, like diplomatic representations and representatives, and Jewish targets, and also against the Iranian opposition, the Mujahideen Khalq, for example, inside the United States. There are agents of Iran currently under arrest and awaiting trial on just charges like that. So, yes, I think it's very prudent to realize that Iran has a reach inside the United States by way of Hezbollah all over the United States, but particularly operating out of the border area, the southern border with Mexico, certainly in collaboration with the Mexican drug cartels. We know that for a fact. Also centered on various areas of Shiite Lebanese communities in which Hezbollah hides, finds safe haven, and cover. Also, the Iranian regime, we know, uses Shiite Islamic mosques as cover positions for its agents, and Hezbollah does that as well.
Well, we already know that Iran has reached out to try to assassinate NCRI members, MEK members here in the United States. I mean, the FBI arrested two late last year that were charged with conspiring to assassinate some members here. So we know they're here. And here's another question. We've discussed this in the past. Iran sends out and has sent out learned individuals of one capacity or another to the West. One individual that comes to mind is one I mentioned earlier, Hossein Mousavian, who's an ambassador, former ambassador to Iran, and now he's in the United States, and he works for Princeton University in the School of Applied Science and International Research as a scholar. Yet he is very much a spokesperson for the regime. I have not had one discussion with him where he has criticized the regime, yet he's in the United States. Is that part of the regime's plan to plant, so to speak, fifth columns in Western countries?
We call them agents of influence, and yes, that is very much the MO of the Iranian regime. Mousavian is a thug and a killer. He was the ambassador in Germany at the time when what they call the Kronos, the Mykonos Cafe assassinations against Kurdish opposition figures was conducted with his deep and close involvement in that assassination operation. How and why he ever was allowed a visa into the United States, much less a professional position as a professor in a university in America, is beyond me. But he is very much a thug and a representative of an agent of influence for the Iranian regime in Tehran.
And it's always surprised me, and the question I asked at a presentation that he gave was, would Americans be allowed to go to Tehran and give a similar presentation where he in the United States was giving soft criticism toward the U.S. and U.S. policies toward Iran? Would we be able to go and give a similar presentation in Iran? And the answer was no. Obviously, he said different circumstances, different country. You could not do that without being arrested immediately. And I, like you, am totally surprised that such individuals have spread out throughout the West, not only the United States, but throughout the West, and yet are allowed to do so. But it does speak to our differences in democracy and differences in lifestyles, doesn't it? He continues to do so, and that's for others to address, I suppose, and not myself on this particular program. Let's talk about, again, a conflict in Iran, what it would look like. I do have some questions that have been emailed in. We talked about the fact that it would be a proxy conflict, that it would not be a direct confrontation. Indirect could be things like Iran could attempt to block the Strait of Hormuz, from which 30% of the world's oil flows. What, in your opinion, would be, if that is an indirect confrontation, would be the position of the Chinese and the Russians?
Well, and I think this should give us some pause. Very recently, within the last few days, as a matter of fact, the Communist Chinese regime in Beijing announced that it is at least considering, it's thinking of sending ships to the Persian Gulf to help protect commercial oil shipping. A lot of course, East Asia writ large. I mean, in general, East Asia's supply of petroleum products comes out of the Persian Gulf, but that the Chinese regime is thinking of actually sending a ship to a ship or more than one ship to the Persian Gulf to apparently engage in protection of the commercial shipping, I think should give us all a bit of pause.
Well, it really should, because the question would be, on whose side would they be? Would they be on the Iranian side or the side of the rest of the world? The Russians don't have as much to lose as the Chinese. As you said, a majority of the oil coming from that part of the world does go through the Strait of Hormuz, and the Chinese have very much an interest. And on whose side would they be? In a confrontation with the United States, would they be on the Iranian side, or would they be on the American side, or would they try to play both against each other? I think certainly the Russians would be on both sides, but certainly would try to gain an advantage, a further advantage with Iran. Would the Chinese be doing the same thing?
Well, certainly in the UN Security Council, both Russia and China have consistently defended the Iranian regime in Tehran.
All right, let me get to a couple of questions that have been emailed in. U.S. invasion in a power vacuum. This individual asked, would a U.S. invasion of Iran create, well, my question is, would an actual invasion occur? This individual asks, would a U.S. invasion of Iran create a power vacuum much like it initially did in Iraq? And would it lead to sectarian violence or clerical and military circles jockeying for control, much as sectarian violence in Iraq? My first question is, do you think the United States would engage in a land war with Iran, an invasion of Iran, much like it did with Iraq?
No, absolutely not. I think we can safely take that potentiality off the table. If conflict were to progress, if the Iranian regime's belligerence and aggression continues to ratchet up, there are many other measures, as I mentioned earlier, that the United States could and would employ, but I do not see a land invasion of Iran anywhere in the realm of possibility. No, that's not going to happen.
Let me get to another question with respect to the same, along the same lines. Well, we're going to forego casualties of U.S. invasion in Iraq. Strategic nuclear weapons. Iran is threatening the mother of all wars. Do they have strategic nuclear weapons that they can use against the United States, or nuclear weapons that they can use against the United States, pardon me, whether strategic or tactical? I think we've already basically touched on that we feel they may, but we don't know if they've been able to miniaturize those weapons.
Yeah, we just don't know if they have deployable nuclear weapons at this point in time. They certainly have a clandestine nuclear weapons program where they are without doubt enriching uranium and building warheads. But does that mean that they have, as I said before, married up the warheads to their missiles in a way that makes them deployable? Don't know.
Okay, we're starting to run out of time. I do just have a couple of more questions to ask you. In 2012, Iran released malware into the networks of Saudi Aramco, which is Aramco Oil Company. It erased a lot of documents. About 75% of the company's computers were affected, and essentially it replaced their presentation with American flags that were burning. Is this the kind of cyber warfare we can expect from Iran? Do you think Iran would engage in cyber warfare to subvert the United States in the event of a continued conflict?
The Iranian regime has already been engaging in cyber warfare against the United States for a long time. I'll point your listeners' attention to a report that came out in November of 2014. It comes from a private American cybersecurity company called Cylance, C-Y-L-A-N-C-E, Cylance, which reported then that they had been tracking Iranian regime cyber operations, hostile, offensive cyber operations, under the code name Operation Cleaver, C-L-E-A-V-E-R, Cleaver. And according to that report, which is open source, it's on the internet, you can look it up, Cylance, Operation Cleaver, the Iranians, as of that date, 2014, that's a good, about 5 years ago now, had succeeded in penetrating all of our strategic critical infrastructure, to include water, transportation, oil, communication, you name it. They had penetrated it with cyber operations. And not just us. They had penetrated, according to this report, the critical infrastructure systems of many other countries around the world. So they've already been doing this. They've been doing it for a long time. Russians posting a few things on Facebook during a presidential campaign is laughable compared to what the Iranians have been doing to us in our critical infrastructure systems.
In sum, do you think that an armed conflict with Iran is inevitable, or do you think it'll be a different kind of conflict?
Different kind of conflict. It's already going on. It is unconventional warfare. It is proxy warfare, cyber warfare. We're in a new era. This is not tanks across the Fulda Gap stuff. This is a whole different kind of warfare, and I am just very hopeful and confident that the Trump administration is aware of that.
Well, I share your confidence. I share your hope as well. Claire, this brings about the end of the program. It is 8 o'clock, and we have another program that's due to come on. I do want to thank you for appearing on tonight's program. Thank you very much for taking that time.
Thanks for having me.
I want to thank tonight's guest, Clare Lopez, Vice President for Research and Analysis at the Center for Security Policy, a Senior Fellow at the London Center for Policy Research, for appearing on tonight's program.